And so it begins. If you're a sports fan, your brain is about to explode. Because after you listen to this podcast, you will never look at a sports event in the same way ever again. Let me give you some of the words you're going to hear. Fixing is rampant. Fixing is regular. Fixing is something that always happens. Now, these are the words of our guest today, a former official from one of the world's biggest sports leagues. And he's telling us a story of organized crime, the mob, the Mafia, the NCAA, the European Champions League, and the World Cup of Soccer itself. Welcome to CrimeWaves. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Declan Hill, and each episode of CrimeWaves, myself and the producers, and this week it's the hardworking and amazing Eric Krebs and Bruce Barber, we bring you stories and interviews with top criminal investigators. This first mini-season is called Blood Sports, and we're examining my professional passion of organized crime in sport. And today we're bringing you an exclusive interview with a man who used to run anti-match fixing operations for the European Soccer Association, or UEFA as it's called. This is one of the world's biggest sports leagues. It runs the Champions League, which is followed by billions of people around the world. Nick Raudenski was an agent for Homeland Security in the U.S. government in counter-narcotics. He fought money laundering in the Caribbean, Greece, and a number of other places around the world. And then he joined FIFA. That's the world's largest sports association. It's followed like a religion around the globe. And he began to fight match fixing in international soccer. A few years later, he moved to UEFA, that's the European Soccer Association, and saw what I'll call frontline action against the match fixers who've affected that sport like a cancer. Now, a note before we begin. This CrimeWaves podcast is an exclusive interview. Nick Raudenski has never spoken at such length over these topics for any other media. However, he has signed a non-disclosure agreement with his former employers, and he doesn't jeopardize that accord in any way in the following interview. But he does tell a fascinating story. Good morning, Nick, or good afternoon, as I should say. Thank you so much for joining us on CrimeWaves.
Thanks, Declan. Thanks so much for the invitation. Really happy to be here. Looking forward to this.
Listen, we're just going to kick off because you dropped an incredibly dramatic LinkedIn announcement 2 weeks ago. You were linking to an attempted fix involving some serious organized crime family here in New York with an attempt match fixing in an NCAA basketball game. And you said, and so it begins. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, what I mean by that is growing up in America, everybody always heard of these things, the fix is in, the ref must be on the take. But the world that you and I live in, and especially in European soccer, is fixing is rampant and fixing is regular. It's just something that always happens. And so now we have this story about the mob infiltrating an NCAA basketball game. And it's like, the thing that we always knew would always happen, it always had existed, is now coming to the fore. And, the perfect line is just, and so it begins, here starts the line of these stories when we're going to hear about players, games, being fixed for financial benefit.
I want to unpack this whole attempted match fixing in the NCAA. And let's be very clear and straight up with our listeners that the fix was serious and it was a credible attempt, but it didn't actually succeed. But before we get into that, some of our listeners' heads are just going to be whirling because you and I are walking a world of organized crime where it's not unusual for our friends and colleagues to be threatened. We've both had weird incidents in the past. You've really been on the front line of this battle for the last 10 years in a really active way. So let's unpack that. What do you mean when you say there's a lot of match fixing, there's players, there's all this kind of stuff? What are you talking about?
Yeah, so in the international environment of soccer, and keeping in mind that it's the world's biggest sport, it's followed by the most amount of people, it has the most revenue generating tournaments, it's the biggest purse, it's the biggest prize when you win some of the biggest tournaments. It literally stops the world when some of these matches are on, some of these games are on, and so when I'm talking about the international environment of this, the international context is soccer is more than life to many of these supporters. It's more
Okay,
than
we
anything
get
is.
that. I mean, we've all seen the football hooligans. I've been in these African cities where, Manchester United and Arsenal play, and the entire city shuts down. Millions of people watching
Yeah.
games thousands of miles away in another country. But are you saying that some of these games are fixed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'm saying is that the profitability of the international gambling market, the profitability of making money off of these games has become so great that if I can offer a bribe, if I can offer an incentive to a player, to a referee, to a goalkeeper to let in a goal, that there's a lot of people that are going to make a lot of money about it. And it's a common thing that we've always heard about. If I have a sure bet, a sure horse that's going to win, a sure team that's going to win a game or score a goal, then I'm going to make a lot of money off of it. And so this
But
is what we're talking about.
and I want to emphasize something because there's a whole bunch of stuff we're not going to talk about. But I want to be clear that you are a senior official. You were a senior official in two of the world's biggest sporting organizations that make the NFL, and that's big, but in international terms, small potatoes. And you're saying this. So this isn't some beer drunken idiot at the back of a bar late at night saying, "Hey, everything's fixed." This is credible official line. Now, when you and I were talking about you doing your first exclusive interview after leaving these organizations, you said, "Hey, there's a whole bunch of stuff I can't talk about. I've signed non-disclosure agreements. I'm not going to talk about what I used to do. I'm going to talk in general terms about this." And I want to make sure that's very clear to everybody. But tell our American and international listeners some of the big cases of fixing that you know about, like where, I mean, has Champions League games been fixed?
If you look back through history, especially in international soccer, there's always been um, implications that World Cup matches have been fixed. There's always been implications that friendly matches have been fixed, and this is what I mean by matches that are a little bit smaller, maybe don't matter as much. Uh, but what we're talking about here is documented matches that are occurring in leagues, in clubs that matter, that are being manipulated either in part or in whole. So either part of the matches are being fixed, for example, the first half score, or the entire match, who's going to win, who's going to lose, by players, by referees, somebody on the pitch, on the field of play. Basically, in other words, taking a dive so that a goal can go in, so that one team wins, one team loses. Now, this is done for betting purposes. This is done for making a lot of money on the international betting market, or this is done simply for a sporting purpose. Two club owners agree, and hey, let me win this game and then I'll let you win the next game, for points or advancement in a cup competition. And so what we're talking about is organized, um, highly visible acts of corruption, on-field sports corruption, that's regularly happening across not only Europe but also across the world.
Is it Has it got to America yet? I mean, that's what many of our American listeners will want to know here. Is it coming to America?
That's kind of what I started off by saying, so it begins. The incidents that have been publicized, the incidents that have been put into the newspapers aren't that many in the US. But we know by approaches that are happening in the US. For example, if anybody's followed the CONCACAF Gold Cup, there's been allegations of match fixing. There's been approaches by organized crime members to the teams in their hotels before the next game, saying, "Look, you know, you don't make a lot. You come from a small Central American or Caribbean country. Why don't you try to make some money off this next game? Let's say they play against the United States national team. There's no chance in, pardon the language, no chance in hell that they're going to be able to compete with that amount of resources. Look, this is soccer. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes those teams do pull off the upsets. But when you're talking about Mexico, Canada, the United States, Jamaica, Costa Rica, you're talking about the top teams in the North America, Central America region. So they go to small Caribbean countries and say, look, you're not going to win against the United States. Why don't you, let in a few goals and make more money in one game than you could have made in an entire year? So,
we're seeing that. We're also seeing, by the way, I just finished doing a major investigation into tennis.
Mhm.
And talking with prosecutors and police guys looking at tennis games at India and Wells, and in small tournaments, ATP tournaments across
Yep.
America, in Cleveland, in this place and that place. How does this work? Just let's break down this stuff. I've written books on this, but
Yep.
tell us how this works. What's the difference between these new modern day fixes and old fixing?
Right. So the new modern day fixes is largely based on the fact that people can make money off of it now with the internationalization, the globalization of the sports betting market. I mean, betting has been
How big
illegal.
is that, this new globalized sports gambling market?
I mean, some estimates are talking about turnover in the 1.6 trillion,
Trillion.
trillion with a
Trillion.
T. Yeah, with a T, per year. And so we're dealing in a situation where in the U.S. betting has largely been illegal for a long period of time. That doesn't mean that betting doesn't happen. China, betting is illegal, but the underground, unregulated markets are absolutely massive. And so, with the globalization of sport, the globalization of football, of soccer, of all these different sports, of the NBA, I mean, all eyes across the world are on sports, in terms of betting. And so it's
Okay.
really metastasized in terms of becoming much more risky because of the size of the betting markets.
So, Nick, there's a clear present danger to American sport. It
Mhm.
comes from this $1.63 trillion sports gambling market. You're getting nibbly fixes happening in small tennis tournaments. Um, you're getting them in these small soccer tournaments. By the way, one of my doctoral students here at the University of New Haven has just done a fantastic paper red flagging a number of these small soccer leagues in America where we're seeing match fixing, indicators of match fixing going on.
Yep.
So we've got it kind of nibbling away. We're not quite in the shark tank yet. We're in the piranha pool. What does a sports fan need to know? Like, how do these fixes happen? Like, break that down for us.
Right. And so look, I mean, any sort of, let's boil this down to the fact that it's a crime and it's involving conspiracy, right? And so it's any sort of conspiratorial crime. There has to be an agreement. There has to be a purpose. There has to be a quid pro quo. Somebody has to get something out of it. And they just look at it in terms of, how can I get somebody to do something that I want? Right? What do I have to offer them in terms of a motivation? Is it financial? Is it status? Is it gifts? Is it a new contract? You know, the fixing that I've seen and the organized crime that I've seen looks at this like any Fortune 500 company. They look at it in terms of investment, right? What do I have to do to get you, the player or the referee, to agree with the fix, right? What do I have to get you to do to throw away everything that you've been building your entire career for one game, for one particular episode? And they handle this in terms of a way that um, they're sort of looking at it in terms of grooming the players or grooming the referees, right? Oh, you know what? But I know these guys, and they're going to give you another opportunity if you do this. Maybe we can get you up to a bigger tournament. Maybe we can get you, to get additional opportunities for your refereeing career. I can get you a new contract to go to Barcelona, Real Madrid, or Manchester United, right? And so they do this based on promises. Okay, well, you do this for me, and it'll just be this one time. You won't have to do it again. So if you don't like it, no problem. Don't worry about it. And we've heard, telltale cases where once the referee step into that, that's it. You're in our pocket, and now you can't get out of it. And so, they're looking at how to maximize their profit with minimizing how much they're going to give in terms of the bribe. They're trying to keep players getting maybe 5,000-10,000 per game, referee, 50,000 per game, in order to, give a penalty or make sure one team wins or loses. Then these organized criminals are basically rolling back and betting, millions on the international betting markets, either legally or illegally, trying to avoid trying to avoid detection on their bets using money laundering techniques, trying to make small bets in multiple, across multiple bookmakers to try to avoid detection, because they know that that's what we're looking for. And so, going through a little bit, yeah. Please,
sorry, Nick, let me share you a story, because as you know, I infiltrated a number of these international match fixing gangs, and I remember a very dramatic conversation. It was dramatic because I was wearing hidden cameras at the time, and was interviewing this guy, and he was what I would call the project manager of a corrupt team in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys had sold a number of their national team games, and these are big matches, as you and I know, in terms of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people watching this game. And I had got involved with a gang of Singaporean match fixers, and I was there in Africa wearing hidden cameras, taping this guy. And the basis of our conversation was he had no idea how much money his Asian match fixing buddies were making. So he was like, they're paying me $10,000 and they're betting millions of dollars. You're going to be my agent. And so we had a series of meetings where he wanted me to be his agent when, to represent this particular team when dealing with the Asian match fixers. So that sense of, by the time you get to the players, they're getting peanuts, and the organized criminals are getting millions of dollars for fixing is really rings true.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the case. There's always the famous line that's attributed to one of the African referees that said, let me distribute how much I have to bribe the assistant referees because I like to cut the cake, right? He wanted to be in control of how much all the other people got as part of their cut, right?
He wanted to be the grand man of the briberies.
That's right. And so once they realize how everybody's using them, how they're just basically the pawns, the used Kleenex, if you will, after they get caught, they just move on to the next guy. They move on to the next plot, the next team, the next referee, the next set of players. So,
and what your fear is that the next continent is going to be America. They're going to be hitting America in a major way.
My fear is that they've already been hitting it and we just haven't been detecting it. So my fear is that it's been there. It's been things that we've grown up with, that we've been living through, that we've seen, but we never really connected what it was. I remember being at soccer games. I remember watching games on TV where the call didn't go the right way, or something happened in the game that you realize as a sports fan just doesn't make sense. Yeah, but why did they do that? Well, why did this guy, why did they do that? And this is before I learned about what match fixing was. I remember seeing referee calls. I remember seeing goalkeeper reactions, during penalty kicks, and just being like, he didn't even try.
Yeah,
This
it
guy
doesn't make
didn't even
sense. Yeah.
try. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. And then I learned about match fixing after that. And
Let's
then I
talk
was
about
like,
the Let's talk about one of the cases you were involved. But before we do that, let me just share with our listeners the story of the Canadian Soccer League. Canada, America. It's pretty much same socioeconomic, cultural background, and the Canadian Soccer League was infested with match fixing and corruption. It's a small league based out of Toronto, Southern Ontario, and it was an international joke. I mean, it was so bad, the fixing was going on that was so rampant that a number of international bookmakers just took it off. Just said, you know what? There's so much fixing and match fixing going on in Canada that we're not going to bet on this. This is so corrupt.
do you remember,
Tell
Declan, just to
Yes,
interrupt you, do you remember where a lot of those clubs were coming from? Do you remember where their history was from? So they're
yes.
the Canadian Croatians, or the
Yeah, a lot of this was Balkan players brought over to various teams, and it got so bad. There was one game, and I want to stress again to our listeners: these games are really small and obscure. They're watched by maybe 24 people, and 3 of those people are walking their dogs. And there was one game down on the Niagara Peninsula, and it was so obvious what was going on. The other team said, "You know what? Saw this. We're going to score in our own net." So they grabbed the ball, this bunch of regular Canadian guys who weren't nearly as good as the Balkan boys were, and started running towards their own net to score, to screw up the fix. And the Balkan players ran down and started defending the net of the Canadian team so they couldn't get it. Like, it was so bizarre what was happening.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. I mean, the only thing that I wanted to just say about that is but even in those games where there's a dozen people in the stands, and you have one bloke who's in the stadium with a camcorder going back and forth recording it, there are people betting on that in Asia, in China, across the world. They're offering these games for betting. So tell me, we're inviting the risk, we're inviting the threats, because the more that we allow the possibility for betting them, the more that this is going to explode. So sorry to interrupt, but just wanted to
No, no, no,
mention.
no. Let's, and I really want to look at the Lampeter case in 1 second, because you did a lot of work on that one. But let's just break down American sports: NFL, NBA, NCAA, NHL, or MLB. Which is the league that's going to face the biggest challenge right away from this?
I think in terms of international prevalence on the gambling markets. I did some work on this in Asia, and there's not a lot of betting happening on NFL in Asia.
Okay.
There is on the NBA though. NHL, the Asians aren't really betting a lot on hockey. Baseball, similar thing. Not a lot of people outside of America or the Latin American countries know much about it. Glorified cricket for the
But
British
it's the
listeners.
NBA that's attracting major liquidity in this market.
Yeah, I mean, and that's because of the globalization of basketball, the
Right.
globalization of the expansion, and right. And so I'm not speaking in terms of intelligence that I have or information that I know that it's being targeted or it's being looked at, but you know we're talking about high scoring games, right? And
But that's
so
where that's where the danger would be in terms of the betting market.
And that's
Let's
exactly
talk
right.
about this.
What's 5 point swing one way or the other, right? But that's
On,
covering a spread.
I'd argue that the issue would be the NCAA, because the players don't get
Absolutely.
paid. And we've got this case. We started the conversation about an NCAA attempted fix. When you read that article, when you read the transcripts of that organized crime guy having the conversation with the purported fixer of the NCAA game, or excuse me, the attempted match fixer of the
Mhm.
NCAA game, what what struck you as familiar about the conversation and the lingo that was going on?
Right. For me, I mean, this is textbook modus operandi of match fixing across, international markets, right? They were almost setting up this move for weeks, if not months. You remember the player, he said, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and my boys have too, right? They just needed the opportunity because they played with such a small school that none of their matches were none of their games were offered on the betting markets. But they knew when they played the big time schools that this was going to be offered, and they were a 17-point underdog, and their games are being offered for betting. So they looked
So,
at this in terms of an
so in other words,
opportunity.
if you're a 17-point underdog, you're expected to lose. Everybody's going
That's
to
right.
expect you to lose anyway.
And
So,
because you're playing against a team that has more resources, that has better players, so you're going to lose anyway. So why not try to make some money out of it, right? And so that's the mentality of the modus operandi that I'm talking about. That they're looking at the various characteristics that exist. You're playing away, right? So your home fans aren't really there. You're not gonna lay down in front of your home fans, but you're expected to lose. You're against a team that's a better resource, that has better players than you. And, all of the characteristics are there for you to lose anyway. So what does it matter if you, and that's what I saw in the transcripts when they say, when he's trying to convince other people in the conspiracy, it doesn't matter if you lose by 1 point or by 10, you're still going to lose. So why don't we make some money out of it?
yeah, there was a great line. I remember there was a Champions League excuse me, at the end of the French season a number of years ago was being fixed by this massively powerful, influential guy. He was actually a cabinet minister and head of Adidas in France for a little bit at that time. And he calls in these players from this other team. He's the owner of one of the big soccer teams in France, Olympique de Marseille. And he says, "You guys are going to lose anyway. Why don't you lose with 30,000 francs in your pocket?" And I've heard variations of that lines from fixers to players again and again and again. Um, when this guy, why was this guy trying to go to the organized crime New York family? Like, well, what was the connection there?
Right, and without having worked the case, and without having been, on the inside and known a lot about it, but people don't have normal people don't have a betting line where they can get multiple thousand dollar bets on games, and if they do, it's going to raise some flags, right? I mean, if I'm a player, if I'm an NCAA player, and I walk into any sports book in Atlantic City, or I try to get a bet on in Las Vegas, and all of my boys are there wearing collegiate shirts, and they're trying to get thousands of bets on, that's going to raise a flag with the gamblers, with the bookmakers. They're going to know something's up, right? Why is everybody trying to really bet the fact that these the underdogs are going to lose by a lot of money, right? And so my generalization is that people don't have access to the betting markets, the normal common person. I wouldn't. I would, and I've been around this market for a long time.
Yes.
I'd have to log in. I'd have to provide my bank details. I'd have to provide an ID card if I wanted to make the bet. It's regulated, and there's safeguards into that, right? You're trying to avoid detection. You're trying to stay off the grid. And so if they go to the organized crime syndicate members, these guys probably are doing all their betting. They're operating their betting, offshore anyway, or in a black market anyway. If you look at the indictments, it accused the Colombo organized crime family of operating illegal gambling businesses, meaning that they're trying to stay off the radar anyway, not
Right.
pay taxes, away from the watchful eye of Uncle Sam, away from the watchful eye of the FBI or law enforcement. So so the players go to these guys because they know them. They've grown up with them. You've grown up in areas with these guys. Some people go on to be successful businessmen. Some people go into organized crime, and so they might have known them and say, "Hey, can you get a bet on for me in this upcoming game to try to avoid detection?"
So effectively, there's two parts of the fix. One is the players are going to lose, below the gambling spread. And the other problem in the fix is getting the money onto the gambling market so nobody notices, just getting it into the thing. Um, let, let, let's switch to a case that you had direct knowledge of, and that's the refereeing case out of Africa, Lampati. Tell us a little bit about that, and please just break it down. I'm a big soccer guy, but many of our listeners are not. So just break this down, please, for us. What was going on in that case?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what I want to clarify here is the caveat that anything that I'm going to talk about this case is publicly available, right?
Right.
I'm not giving any insights. I'm not giving
Yes.
any information that was, that wasn't publicly available to everybody, which allows me to be able to just tell you about what happened with this case. And so the way that qualification for the World Cup goes. You don't just rock up and you have your 24 teams that show up in June or July every 4 years and start playing a tournament, right? There's a long drawn out qualification process that goes into this. And in some countries or some continents, Africa, for example, this starts 2, 3, 4 years in advance of the final competition. Right. So even now we're 2 years away from the next World Cup. They're playing qualification matches. They're playing matches to figure out who's good enough to get to that final tournament. And so what happened here was anytime you have these international matches of this criteria, it draws a lot more activity, a lot more interest in the international betting markets. What that means is that there's a much higher volume in the amount of bets that are happening. I'll put it to you this way: say if you have two bodies of water, say you have what's a real big lake, Lake Michigan,
Right.
in the U.S. and Canada, right? But then you have your bathtub at home, okay, and you take a bowling ball and you drop the bowling ball into your bathtub, you're going to see that splash. Right? If you drop
Right.
that bowling ball into Lake Michigan or the Hudson Sound, you're not going to really see any splash. You're going to see a little bit of a ripple, and then that's it. When you get into the
What I
international environments with soccer gambling, we're talking about the large bodies of water when there's so much gambling, so
Okay, you
much
had me.
liquidity.
You had me and the listeners scratching our heads there with your bodies of water. In other words, you've got cash going into the Canadian Soccer League, which was fixed, but it was so small, that league, that people would notice the fixing was going on. When you've
Exactly
got
right.
these big World Cup qualifying matches and it being followed by tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, the amounts of money you can fix those games and no one's going to notice. So the only problem now you have is getting the players to go along with you. You don't have the problems in the betting market. It's just whether you can get the players or the referees.
Right. So put it this way: the bigger the league, the bigger the game, the larger the market, the larger the
Right.
body of water. Right. And so if you're talking about, a local game, a team again from Connecticut against a team from Rhode Island, that's not really big stuff. But if you go U.S. against Canada, that has international implications, right? And so there's
Which
going
is
to be
why you were saying, hey, the NBA is going to have problems here because there's so much gambling in Asia on NBA, and I'm saying, hey, NCAA, because the players aren't getting paid. But you're saying, well, yeah, but there's less betting going on in those NCAA games than there is on NBA.
right, because there's only going to be the bigger, like if you go back to this the St. John's Wagner game, he was looking for his opportunity because none of his other games were offered on the betting market, right? He had to wait until they played one of the big teams so they could get their bets. Now, if you play St. John's, UConn, Georgetown, Syracuse, a lot, Duke, all of these games are offered, for betting on the betting markets. But I want to
Right.
spin back to the concept of the
Africa
World
case,
Cup
yeah.
the World Cup qualifier case, right? This was Senegal against South Africa.
Okay.
And now these are two quasi
Powerhouses.
powerhouses in African soccer, almost perennial qualifiers. Senegal for the World Cup, them, Nigeria, Cameroon, Egypt. These are some of the big African teams, right? If you look at the players that Senegal had on their team, they're representing Napoli, Liverpool, all the big clubs, right? So this game is being offering a lot on the betting markets, attracting a lot of international attention. And here we have a referee that has really been a journeyman. He's been at the almost end of his career. He's had dozens, if not hundreds, of games that he's officiated, right? But now you have an opportunity when the match is now for big stakes, and they're banking that. They're hoping that their bets weren't going to be detected. But in this particular case, 5 independent separate companies detected suspicious betting that this game was going to have more than 2.5 goals in the game. Now, what does that mean for our listeners scratching their head? You can't score a half a goal in soccer, right? It's a betting nomenclature where it's either going to be 2 goals or 3 goals or more than 3 goals, right? So it's a betting price break. And so they wanted to make sure that there's going to be more than 2.5 goals in a particular game. And who can guarantee that?
The fixers have paid somebody in that game, and these guys are watching, these guys being the bookmakers, they're watching the odds on this game the same way that stockbrokers watch the movements of a share going up and down on NASDAQ or a New York Stock Exchange.
100% right. That's exactly right.
So who have the fixers reached in this game? I mean, if they've got Senegal and South Africa, these Premier League, some of the guys are Premier League, some of them are like the top Italian teams, Spanish teams. Who do they get?
Right. And so if you wanted to make sure that you're going to get a guaranteed number of goals, you're going to go to the one person that can directly influence that, and that's the referee. And in this particular case, the guy who can do something like calling a penalty to increase the opportunities of scoring in that particular game. And so that's what the allegations in this case were about, that he was fixed to give a penalty that, when you see the replay, was suspect at best, not a penalty, but he didn't hesitate to give the, blow the whistle and to give the penalty kick.
And these games, by the way, Senegal, South Africa, this is a great case that you brought to us because they're on YouTube, and there's anybody who wants to see it. This ain't the Canadian Soccer League. This ain't 24 people, somebody watching a dog. This stadium is full. I mean, This is 60,000 people watching. This is being televised live. Yeah. People are getting into this, and they fixed the referee to do this.
And what's amazing about this is that this is in South Africa's home stadium, and the penalty went against South Africa. So after halftime and after the game, they had to swarm the referees with security because they were so fearful because of this dubious call that he was going to be under physical threat, that people were going to either jump over onto the pitch, storm the locker room, wait for the referees to come out. And so, look, the referees across the board and in general serve an inherent risk when they do this. And, we hear stories about, people, vigilante justice, where they go right onto the pitch and, break the referee's arm or leg for fixing.
Yeah, but in this case, Nick, yep. I'm not endorsing football hooligans by any way, but it's, in this case, the guy would be bought off to give this penalty, to make this match fix happen. Allegedly. What happened? Talk to listeners through what happened to the rest of this thing in terms of this particular case.
Right. So what happened in this particular case is the referee gives this sort of dodgy penalty. The penalty's converted. He also gave a few other calls in the game that allowed Senegal to score. The goal, the match finishes above the number of goals that they needed for betting purposes. Job done. They call the game's off. Everybody goes home. They whisk the referee team securely back to their country, fly them out. But then the international environment starts to kick up, right? This globalization that I was talking about. Twitter goes alight with people saying, have you seen this? Oh my God, you got to take a look. Oh, the fix must have been in. FIFA needs to investigate this case. So they're starting to grow this international, this international aura that something was wrong in this game, which really, so you have that, you have the public perception, you have the betting flags that, that start to come up after the match. All the betting companies start to look at the game and say there's something not right. People on the international gambling markets had anticipated that this game was going to have more than a certain amount of goals. And so people in China, people in Asia are betting knowing that that penalty was going to happen or that goals were going to be given in that game with such confidence that it raised the flags in terms of the betting market. And so, after that point, Senegal filed a protest, official protest, which contributed to launching an official investigation from FIFA.
I'm sorry, it was South Africa that launched the protest, was it not?
No, sorry. Yes, South Africa launched the protest. Sorry for that missed it. Launched the international protest that they were, that they were unjustly refereed against. They started to do the analysis of the referee performance, analysis of the video performance, and then, as you do with any investigation, you just start, putting the dots together, putting the betting together with the playing performance together with a suspicious history of this particular referee having 7 other matches that he's done similar things, given penalties in, which, then warranted the official investigation and the official proceedings against Mr. Limpety.
And that game eventually has to be replayed, saying, hey, you know what? It's kind of like what happened with the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympics, where you had 2 gold medals given out because the fixing had become so obvious.
And so what happens is, for the most part, matches are fixed and matches are suspected, and eventually, 2 years down the line, the evidence comes out. But the tournament's already gone, the matches were already played, and there's nothing you can do about the sporting merits of this case. This happened, and this is a big swing in this particular qualifying group, right? This had implications of who was potentially going to reach the finals of the World Cup. And so it had sporting implications. After the disciplinary bodies reached their, conclusions, they ordered, for the first time ever, a World Cup qualifying match to be replayed on sporting merits, that the match was manipulated. And so, it was really a monumental case. It was the first time that a match was ordered to be replayed. So, it was a pretty significant situation, and it also gave a lot of other people the belief in, investigations into betting monitoring, into intelligence related to, the information related to the potential persons involved.
Nick, let me take a big step back. You
Yeah.
are one of those investigators, and you and I are kind of doing this dance. We're treading through a minefield.
Uh-huh.
I can't ask you those questions about investigations you have direct knowledge of, because you were at FIFA, the world organization that runs soccer. You then transferred over to run up the anti-match fixing division at UEFA, the European things. And again, for American listeners, these are massive, huge sporting organizations, much bigger than the National Football League, which is the biggest one here in America, both in terms of symbolism and finance and all this stuff. But the question I think that many people have, the very obvious one, is how did an American get to be at the center of international European-dominated soccer? Like, what's that story?
Right. And so, look, I mean, I often say that the short answer is I was born on the wrong continent, right? I was one of those guys that grew up with soccer. It was in my blood. It was in my family. We were born, second generation immigrants to the U.S. Growing up in Pennsylvania, everybody was something slash American, Italian American, Irish American, German American, Czech American, African American, and then we were, this American view of this melting pot, and everybody came with that background that soccer was your game, right? And so we grew up, we grew up with all, the big four sports. We grew up with, with just in a sports family, but soccer, for from the love of my older brother, was always our main thing that we inherited, right? And so, in me saying, like, I think I was born on the wrong continent, I sort of say it tongue in cheek, I continue
Because
to
you're a very
love
patriotic American. I mean, you and
very,
I have
very
discussed
patriotic.
this.
I travel around the world. Even before before the jobs at FIFA and UEFA, I traveled to Germany to watch the U.S. national team in the 2006 World Cup in Germany. We travel around the world. These are the things that we did on nights and weekends when you had your normal day job Monday through Friday, but nights and weekends were for soccer.
But brother,
Wake
you
up early.
became, that was your night job. Now, well, until two
Yeah,
weeks ago,
yeah.
your day job was at these European-centered institutions, being an American, and using. Just tell us how a Yankee got to not King Arthur's court, but the court of FIFA and UEFA.
Yeah, so let me take even a bigger step back. I've always been fascinated by investigations, whether it's investigative journalism, whether it's gumshoe work, whether it's old school policing, even in the comedy movies. I mean, I grew up on a mixture between James Bond and Inspector Clouseau, right? I mean, I loved investigation aspects of it, and we always have something that got us into our our chosen profession. And for me, it was the JFK assassination. That's when I realized, look, that the assassination of a president should never happen. I wanted to be a Secret Service agent. I wanted to really, get involved in federal law enforcement. And then I started learning about investigations, about fraud investigations, about crime investigations. And it continued to spiral from there. When, I was a middle schooler, for those that grew up in the US, and I knew I wanted to be an investigator, no matter how that happened. And so I studied it in undergrad. I almost went to the University of New Haven to play soccer. I ended up going to another school in New Jersey to just study criminology, right? Try to make myself um, as well-rounded as possible to be an investigator. And I remember applying for every job I could, for IRS, for Secret Service, for State Department, for FBI, and I got hired on to be a customs investigator. And this is pre 9/11, right? And so we were investigating cross-border crime, smuggling, trafficking, money, and then 9/11 happens, right? The whole shift goes towards terrorism, terrorist financing, terrorist investigations, right? So I go throughout my career and continue to progress 10, 12, 13 years for the United States government. I became a Homeland Security investigator, really trying to, hone the craft of investigations, being involved in international programs, international training operations abroad, working with our counterparts, trying to build collaboration, right? And then one day, I remember being at an office and an old soccer teammate of mine sent me a job description. He's like, "Hey, mate, this really sounds like you." And it was a job description to be in FIFA security. And for me, this was something that I had always dreamed of doing. I always dreamed of being able to put the two and two together, right? My day job, being able to put together investigations and security work within the world of football. And so for me, it was, despite what you want to say about FIFA reputation at the time, I believed so much in the integrity of sport, the values of sport, that I wanted to to try to apply my craft, my investigative skill set, knowing what I knew about investigations, about programs, in the football environment. And we had a very small team, and so I applied for the position, and I really sort of did it as a maybe it's a drop in a bucket, and they ended up calling me, offer me an opportunity to ply my craft in international sports. And so sort of at times pinch myself in the early years. I remember my first year meeting absolute idols, the people that you grew up with having on your wall. Pelé, the international superstar from Brazil. I mean, he was the guy who was on my wall as a kid that inspired me to be, a soccer player. And now I'm seeing him in person, and so there's that allure of doing what you love, on nights and weekends, and what you travel for, and what your real passion with, your sort of your day career, your day job of investigations, and putting these two together, trying to tackle organized crime, try to, make a real dent in protecting the integrity of of the sport that we love. I mean, for me, it was it was an absolute dream job.
Let me jump to 2 weeks ago, where you decide to resign from UEFA. Again, we're not going to talk about that, but almost the same day, European Police, the umbrella organization that organizes all 54 European countries in this organization, comes out and says there is a sustained, systematic, clear linkage between organized crime and European soccer. And what's your sense of that? Now you're still an American, you're still in the middle of Europe, you're still in the middle of this fight. How are you guys going to be able to take on this sustained, systemic, organized crime presence in sport?
Right. So the best way that I can put this is putting it into the context of history, right? If you look at the war on drugs, if you look at things like Miami Vice, Scarface, Wall Street, the mid '80s, where cocaine and money is rampant. We are 20 years behind the curve from that, right? We're in the wild west of organized crime and sports corruption and international betting, right? And so what we have to do is really get smart quick, right? What we have to do is sort of change the narrative a little bit on what we've been doing for the past couple of years. I remember I always told one famous story that I got into this job, and I started to look at things like, your book or posts that you've made. And I look now 8 years later, and those same exact talking points, those same exact programs are being espouted in conferences, in podcasts and whatever. The narrative isn't changing. Right. We have to really change the way that we're looking at this. We have to tackle this like as if you're watching Netflix and there's this, the series of Ozark or Fear City or, any of the current topics of how we're tackling the mafia, how we're tackling terrorism. This is a war for the soul of a sport, of sport across the world, whether it's basketball, whether it's NCAA, whether it's soccer, whether it's whether it's baseball internationally. I mean, this is the heart of what drives us as a community, and this is a threat to that.
Nick, can I just jump back a little bit? When I'm teaching the students here at the University of New Haven about fighting sports corruption, I start with 4 major organized crime task force investigations into horse racing. And the reason why I make the link between horse racing and regular sports is I say, this is where sports is going to end up.
Yep.
Because very few horse racing fans go to that sport because they love horses. They kind of like horses, but they love their
betting.
Gambling and they love their betting.
Yeah,
and
right.
No one is surprised that there's massive amounts of doping, and nobody is surprised that there's massive amounts of fixing in horse racing, and nobody is surprised that the horses are treated really badly. And my fear is that sports are going to end up the same way as horse racing. They're going to become simply vehicles for betting
Yeah.
rather than.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're exactly right. And look, it's like anything, right? If we neglect it, the decay is going to continue to happen. You know, the broken windows theory that, you know, if we don't attack this right at the beginning, right at the start, well, and you know, it's not the start. It's been going on for,
10
you
years.
know, for years. You know, I mean, from the start. When did you do your PhD in Oxford?
I was the first guy to talk about this because I
Yeah.
got
When
into
was
the
it? What
gangs
year?
back in it was 2005. I made the first announcement in Copenhagen saying
Yeah.
we're going to face a tsunami of match fixing,
Yeah.
and as a
Yeah, that's right.
Canadian coming into Europe, it was a difficult haul.
And can you say, Declan, now let me reverse this, you know, can
Yes.
you say after 15 years,
Mhm.
are we any closer to winning this war?
No, in many ways, I think we've gone back. I think we're normalizing corruption. You know, many of our institutions are bending over to, instead of fighting corruption, to embed corruption in the normal practices, so it
You know, and
becomes normal.
I think you're exactly right, because I think what sport get a bad rap on, and I'm talking in the international environment, is it suffers the brunt of things that happen in society, right? They'll say like there's a racism incident, right, in the stadium, and they're like, UEFA's not doing enough to fight against racism. The FIFA's not doing enough to stand up against, you know, against these things. But these things exist in society. What is the government, what is the country doing to tackle its problem with racism? What is the country doing to tackle its problem with corruption? I mean, the corruption conventions have existed for dozens of years. And are we ever any further along in tackling, you know,
I disagree
corruption?
with you, Snick, and let's
Oh,
end on this agreement to disagree, and then let's agree to have you back on the program because I'd really like
but
to
let me
break down the
clarify. Yeah,
mechanism.
let me
Please.
clarify one thing on that.
Yeah.
What I'm not saying is that governments aren't doing enough. What I'm saying is that you can't expect a non-law enforcement body to clean up the situation, right? If you look at a lot of the cases that have really changed the the international environment related to tackling corruption, it has been big government police takedowns. It's been investigative journalism that has uncovered corruption. It's been whistleblowers that have blown the whistle on things. It hasn't been so much so sports organizations taking the responsibility and blowing itself up.
I don't want to get into, obviously there are delicate areas with UEFA and FIFA, you know, these big sporting organizations that you've just left. But what's your take on these guys in terms of whether they're actually going to deal with these issues?
Well, that I'm not gonna speak about, because I think we all need to realize that either you're part of the problem or you're the part of the solution. And what I want to really focus on is how are we going to change the narrative of what's happening with sports integrity? How are we going to change the fact that we've been doing the same thing for the past 8 to 10 years, that it's the same PowerPoints that are being rolled out, it's the same talking points. But what did want to mention is that, you know, sometimes I think that, you know, people blame sport for not acting enough. But what I want to mention about that is these problems exist in society, and sport is a reflection of its culture, of its society. So if racism exists in a society, it's going to exist in sport. If corruption, and specifically talking about match fixing, if corruption is in the society, that's a way that people start to, you know, desensitize from it. It's like, yeah, but you know, of course, everybody kind of takes some money. It's a way that they desensitize to stepping up and saying, no, that's not right. You can't take, you know, an extra cut just to make sure that there's more. So if corruption exists in society, of course it's going to exist in the sports that, you know, that we all know and love. But, you know, that we all have to be part of the solution, that we all have to continue to get enough cooperation, that we have to get enough, you know, actual operations, actual, you know, actual cases that we can, rely on to change the narrative. I mean, if you look through the history of sports corruption, what were the big cases that have really moved the needle when it comes to the international sports environment? It's not the federations, it's not the international bodies that are stepping up and saying enough's enough. It's a whistleblower that comes forward. It's an investigative journalist, Declan, maybe like yourself, or a New York Times or an Associated Press or any, a Sunday Times article that's exposing things. It's the police organizations that that bust open the Bolcom case, that leads to some of the biggest arrests and exposure of match fixing in Europe. So we can't say governments aren't doing enough, because sometimes they're the only ones that are doing something, and it's something that you said in one of your articles. And so, that's what I really want to end on, is that you were saying that governments aren't doing enough. Sure, there's always more that can be done, but everybody has to do more. Otherwise, we're going to continue to lose this war.